Hello, everyone. Welcome back from our really exciting panels this morning, setting up some of the problems and some of the potential solutions around college affordability, or should we call it affordability? So we're having something that I'm going to think of as a polling and messaging interlude, and it's going to start with all of you. So I'm going to introduce a tool that we will have recurring throughout some of the events today, and it's the Century Foundation's polling tool. So what you'll do is you'll start by texting 22333 to engage with the Century Foundation's polling platform. So if everyone can pull out your silenced cell phones and do that now, you'll receive a message back letting you know that you're linked with our polling system. And I'll give you a second to do that while I set up our question. So the first question that we're going to test with this polling tool is true or false, the way that Washington politicians talk about college affordability and student debt reflects the public's perspective on these questions. All right. It's always fun to watch the bars move around. And it seems like some of us may have agreed with the idea that some of these perspectives are filtered through organizations that talk to organizations that talk to people, with 84 folks here thinking that Washington politicians are not describing student debt and college affordability in ways that reflect the public's understanding of these issues. This theme has come up a few times, and some of the messaging difficulties with framing college affordability and promise programs has come up. And with that, I want to introduce a fellow, Jonathan Voss, who's going to tell us a little bit more about his work with these perceptions. And rather than talking to the organizations that talk to the organizations that talk to people, he has worked with some of the partners at this conference doing some polling around college affordability questions. So Jonathan Voss joined Lake Research Partners in 2011 as a senior analyst and has experience conducting quantitative and qualitative research. Specific to our conversation today, he's worked with partners like New America, Demos, and Consumers Union to explore public attitudes about higher education and student debt. So we're going to hear from him a little bit about what he's found in his polling research on these questions.
Thank you very much. I am also actually an NYU alumni, so it's nice to be home in NYU in DC. And I'm very excited to be here. I'm also very excited for July 2023, when I personally am done with my student loans. So I'm not keeping track or anything. But again, my name is Jonathan Voss. I am a vice president with Lake Research Partners, and I'm very happy to be here. And I'm going to share with you a couple things. And I first want to give a special thank you to New America and Demos for their permission to share some of the data that we have conducted on their behalf over the past year and a couple years. So I'm going to go kind of in three buckets for you. First, there's been some news about a partisan divide when it comes to attitudes towards higher education. Many of you might remember some Pew data that came out a couple years ago. And I'm going to discuss a little bit about what that means and what's behind some of that. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about perceptions towards student loans, education debt in general, the salience of the issue, the dimensions of the concerns that people have. And then thirdly, I'll leave you with some public opinion on various policies, some of which I think you have discussed this morning. And I would be remiss if I didn't include a little bit of messaging guidance. I know you are all policy folks, but I want to give you, in the spirit of organizations talking to organizations who eventually talk to people, some language tips that work, I think, with people in terms of advancing some of the policies that you all support. So first, many of you have probably seen this headline. This was the Pew Research study back in 2017 showing the partisan divisions when it comes to national institutions. And one of the alarming implications here is what I have circled lower right was the partisan difference when it came to colleges and universities and the perception of whether or not they're having a positive or negative effect on the country. Republicans net 22% negative, Democrats net 53% positive. What we did with New America is we had a theory as to what was driving some of this, and there's a couple things, frankly, that are driving some of this. First, we looked at two different questions: favorability towards higher education, towards colleges and universities, and then we looked at replicating the Pew data of the positive or negative effect that they're having. And we looked at colleges and universities versus colleges and universities in your area. And there are partisan differences in views of favorability towards colleges and universities, as well as those in your area. But generally speaking, strong favorability for colleges and universities, especially those in your area. Democrats net 69 favorability, 79% overall favorable towards colleges and universities. Republicans just net 5 favorability, 46 to 41. But when it comes to colleges and universities in your local area, 65-point net favorability for Democrats, 33 point, net favorability for Republicans. So there's greater favorability for Republicans when it comes to colleges and universities in their area. Looking at the effect that colleges and universities have on the country as a whole, net positive effect compared to other institutions, and this was our replication of the Pew data. And similar results, we found a net 43 positive effect among Democrats, a net 17 negative effect among Republicans for colleges and universities. For those in your area, both positive, plus 52 net positive effect among Democrats, plus 3 positive effect among Republicans. But the other theory that we had going in here beyond perceptions of institutions in your area versus institutions writ large was when we're having conversations about institutions, period. We are here sheltered underground from the crazy news outside of our hall, and there are seemingly a lot of institutions that are under attack when it comes to the media, when it comes to churches, financial institutions, et cetera. And one of the things that we captured in this survey with New America was where we asked the question really mattered. So when we asked people on the left here, it was the first thing they were asked: how favorable are you to colleges and universities, or colleges and universities in your area? As opposed to when it's the last thing asked, after being asked all those other institutions, churches and religious organizations, the national media, labor unions, and banks and financial institutions, et cetera. When it's the last thing asked, favorability declines. So in the context of a conversation around institutions in our country, perceptions about the favorability for colleges and university erode as a result. And the implication there is that a larger conversation in other institutions, whether it be banks or religious institutions or the national media, unfortunately affect perceptions towards colleges and universities. The sample sizes here were too small to look individually by partisanship, but Republicans were the ones driving some of this decrease across. And we rotated first when we were asking the effect that people felt that it had versus their overall favorability for it. So we wanted to provide a little bit more context to that Pew study to understand a little bit more of what's going on, and we found that certainly colleges and universities in your area, greater favorability, particularly among Republicans, and that when we ask it independently on its own, greater favorability than in the context of a larger conversation about other institutions in our country. But colleges and universities, as you know, is a broad term, and there are many different types of education after high school. People are most favorable towards community colleges and vocational and job training programs. And this is from the DEMOS work that we did in January of this year. And frankly, not a lot of partisan differences here about community colleges. 88% of Democrats and 88% of Republicans are favorable towards community colleges. It's actually the independents who have slightly weaker numbers. 87% of Democrats and 85% of Republicans favorable towards vocational job training programs. What we find here between the discrepancy of favorability towards vocational programs and community colleges as opposed to private or public colleges and universities or simply for-profit colleges is this sense that vocational job training programs and community colleges have a little bit more of a quicker on-ramp to a job, a specific trade. So it's that connection to people getting a job immediately after the education, after high school. I'm not showing you here, but we asked an interesting question with New America. Which do you think is the best route for a job and career today? An apprenticeship program, a vocational school, or a 4-year degree? And people narrowly said vocational and job training. an apprenticeship. When we ask them, what would you encourage a child or someone who's seeking education after high school, overwhelmingly people go towards a 4-year degree. So even though they might see a quicker on-ramp to a job right now, there's still a desire to encourage children to pursue the best education they possibly can, the highest level of education that they possibly can. So with that as kind of the backdrop of overall favorability towards colleges and universities, I want to get into a little bit about the salience of the issue. This is a kind of a generic question that a lot of pollsters ask. What's the most important issue facing the country today? You can see student debt, college affordability, very much at the bottom of the list. This should not surprise anyone. This question typically reflects what's going on in the national media, the national discourse. This poll was in January when repeal of the ACA was one of the top stories being reported on. We asked this question recently for a different client, and the number one issue was dysfunction in government. So this is a very fluid issue agenda that people see. But what I show that to say that while it might not be on the headlines, I don't want that to obscure the fact that there are some serious concerns about people's ability to afford college, and student debt is an issue in America. So here we ask several questions with Demos. On the left, how worried are you about student debt? Not as about an issue, but just you personally, how worried are you about student debt? Now, in our sample, only 33% of the sample reported having student debt, either for themselves, a child, or a family member, and 49% expressed concerns that they're worried about student debt in general. And what those worries are vary between one's ability to pay it back, the impact of student debt on other aspects of the economy, or our society as a whole, et cetera. But that does not mean that people do not think that this is a serious issue. In the middle here, how serious of a problem do you think student debt is in America? Not necessarily your concerns as an issue. 92% very or somewhat serious. 52% say it's a very serious issue. And here we have partisan alignment. 93% of Democrats, 92% of Republicans say it's a very or somewhat serious issue. A little bit of an intensity difference. 66% of Democrats say it's very serious compared to 47% of Republicans. Nevertheless, that is bipartisan unity in the sense that, that student debt is a serious problem in America today. And another dimension of this, how worried are you about the next generation's ability to afford college? 70% say they're worried compared to 26% who say they are not worried. People see the cost of attending as a barrier, and that's actually very important for us when we're talking about policy, because the cost of attending is a barrier to someone's completion. We asked a variety of issues here. Lack of quality preparation in high school. Maybe people think that the high school quality is bad and that's why someone can't complete their degree. They're not personally dedicated to their own education. Those are all at the bottom of the list here. Overwhelmingly, 59% on the first ask say the cost of attending is the largest barrier to completing education after high school. 75% in total when we asked for their first and second choice. I mentioned that 33% of Americans in our sample say that they have debt from student loans for themselves, a child, or another family member. And there were two interesting things in the demographics here. First, just the overwhelming racial disparities here. Black non-college graduates, Latino non-college graduates, Asian Pacific Islander non-college graduates, all having the same or more, reporting the same or more level of just having it, not necessarily the amount of having debt for education after high school compared to whites who have actually completed their education, who are college graduates in themselves. So just a tremendous racial discrepancy here in who debt impacts as an issue. Also fascinating to me, 24% of grandparents say that they have debt for themselves, a child, or a family member, and 12% of retirees. Hopefully I'm retired before July of 2023. I doubt that's the case. I'd love to be a retiree in that case. That said, the fact that 12% of retirees who have all sorts of other financial constraints also have student loans that they're paying for themselves or a family member just shows you the depth of the problem and the scope of which, the amount of people that it faces. Do you think someone like you can graduate from college without any debt? Just 21% of Americans say yes, 65% no. There is a desire for people to be able to work their way through school. And one of the refrains that you sometimes hear in debates is that, well, students can just work their way through higher education. There's a little bit of divisiveness in this. 49% agree that a student can work their way through college without going into debt. 37% disagree. Should a student be able to? People overwhelmingly say yes. 83% agree that a student should be able to. So a wild discrepancy between the desire that, yeah, that sounds like a good thing, someone working their way through school, they should be able to do that, but only 49% agree that that's actually possible. And yet 21% of Americans say that someone like them could actually go through college without getting any debt. So it's not the top of the issue agenda, but there are some serious concerns about education debt and some serious concerns about people's ability to pay it off. And obviously this is a very widespread problem with 33% of the country facing some sort of debt. So let me get into a little bit of some policy that we've tested across these surveys. First, I want to start with some policy values here. This was from our New America study. 74% of Americans agree that we should ensure, our country should ensure students can receive a higher education that leads to good job prospects. Education writ large is a core value for people, especially when you're talking about K through 12 education. There is a transactional component, though, to higher ed. And as you'll see when I get at the end, I urge us to talk about education after high school in more than just a transactional context. It's not just that it leads to a job. It leads to a whole host of good things in terms of one's life and also the societal benefit. But nevertheless, there is this agreement with this transactional component that you should deserve to have a higher education that leads to a good job prospect as a very concrete outcome. Higher education institutions should not just rely on federal financial aid like grants and loans. There is some idea, and we'll get into the details of some of the policies that we looked at there. Low-income students should have easier access to federal financial aid like grants and loans for higher education. 69% of Americans agree with that, 35% strongly. We looked at a variety of the policy proposals being proposed by this administration in the Higher Education Act. And by and large, when you get into the weeds of these policies, the key finding here is that large gray bar, which is the percent who are not actually sure what to make of these rules. These are very complicated policies. People aren't 100% sure. People are most opposed to the 90-10 rule, or a change to the 90-10 rule, allowing for-profit colleges and universities to accept more than 90% of their revenues from federal aid programs such as grants and loans. I'm not even 100% sure what that means. But we looked at some what is driving some of the attitudes here. And in terms of support for these policies, one of the core dimensions is choice, and it increases choices for students. And that's something that proponents of these policies have advocated. In terms of messaging against, for the 90-10 rule, people found, when given an explanation, that this diverts aid from quality programs. For EQUIP, people found that this might allow people to accrue debt from unproven programs. So they want to know that programs are proven to be able to have positive outcomes. When it comes to zero interest loans, this was more of a divisive policy when we looked at underneath what the attitudes were. People do like that there's transparency and you know exactly what you're going to have to pay up front. But one of the arguments that people found in opposition to this is that for those who want to pay early or quickly or on time, this can actually be a penalty and require them to pay a little bit more. In terms of gainful employment, the positive argument is this does provide a little bit of choice for people, but people did not like that it might allow fraudulent programs to operate without any consequences, so kind of protecting students from being taken advantage of. And similarly, when it comes to short-term training, this was the one where we found the strongest support. People like the idea, and as I mentioned earlier, talking about community colleges and vocational schools, that a four-year degree is not the only road towards a job or career, and that there needs to be a recognition that some of these short-term programs can have a positive effect. On the other hand, people don't like that this might allow aggressive marketing for poor quality programs. So in the weeds, people aren't 100% sure, and there's the not sure there is, I think, the key headline. When we're talking about affordability, and a lot of the discourse has been about debt-free college, et cetera, or free tuition, what it might be, we asked people specifically in our DEMOS work, tuition is tuition, right? But there are other costs associated with attending a higher education. And we asked, people who go to school full-time and work-time should not have to go into debt in order to pay for books, groceries, transportation, and rent. Versus, which do you agree with more, paying for college and gaining economic benefits a degree can provide is an individual's personal responsibility. By almost 2-to-1, Americans side with the idea that you should not have to go into debt trying to buy groceries pay for books, transportation, and afford rent. And frankly, this is one where while there is a partisan difference, directionally it's the same. By 69 to 24, 35 points, Democrats agree with the statement in blue. By 8 points, 47 to 39, Republicans also agree with the statement in blue. So the idea of being able to attend education after high school without accruing debt, people do realize that is more than just the idea of tuition, that it is also covers the other aspects of higher education, of being a student and the realities that a student faces. We looked at making tuition to public colleges free for all households versus putting an income cap on that. And I was actually really surprised to find that there's no difference here. And in focus groups, what we hear is whatever income cap you put, whether it's 125,000, whether it's 250,000, there's someone out there who says, you know what, in my household, yeah, I would be above that cap, but man, it's still really hard to afford a quality education. If I want to send my child to a 4-year school, it's still going to be a burden. And what we hear in focus groups is there is a simplicity, frankly, to not having an income cap on this. There is an inclusiveness of making sure that everyone has skin in the game, that even if you are a high-income household, that you also can realize the benefit for this. And just shocking, frankly, to see no difference across party lines here. One difference among Democrats, well within the margin of error, not needing to have an income level here. Now, it's possible if we had a different income level that these numbers would change. But the headline here was that there's strong support. 71% of Americans, including a 57% majority of Republicans, favor making tuition to public colleges free for all households. But as I mentioned, what one spends on college and what might result in debt does not just include tuition. And the stronger policy we found was ensuring all students can graduate from public 2- and 4-year colleges without debt. And it might seem like without debt as opposed to debt-free doesn't really matter. It actually does matter. Debt-free kind of situates it in a little bit more of an economic context, a fiscal context, a transactional context. When we talk about ensuring someone can graduate without debt, remember when I showed you that slide where 75% say the cost of attending is the barrier for someone's ability to graduate and complete college? Debt is a barrier for people, and when we position debt rhetorically as a barrier, there is support for removing that barrier for what people value and see as a good thing for people to do. So it might not seem like a lot, but saying without debt situates debt as a barrier and helps generate support for that policy. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I can't help myself. Part of what we did in some of these studies was look at various messaging appeals, and I want to give you some just kind of key values to keep in mind as you discuss with yourselves and with other organizations and eventually to the public. So on the left hand is language to say, on the middle column is language to avoid, and a little bit of why. Now this is true across the gamut of education, whether you're talking about preschool, early childhood education, K through 12, or higher education. We sometimes talk about we want to do this thing, we want to make college more affordable to allow people to have the ability to succeed. Succeed is a little bit of a elitist conception of what the ultimate outcome is, especially when you talk to parents. They want their kids to be happy. They want them to find a job that makes them happy, regardless of what it is. They don't have to be a doctor or a lawyer. If they're doing something that makes them happy, that's all the parent wants. And so being able to talk about this in a values context, that these policies help children and students have the ability to pursue their dreams, that is more values-driven, more aspirational, and kind of gets us out of a transactional context that sometimes can trip up support for policies. What is the ultimate outcome? Saying that we all benefit as opposed to kind of narrow silos of our economy benefits or our country benefits, or we have a healthier democracy. People definitely like those outcomes, but there is a stronger value to having a kind of a broader benefit, saying that we all benefit. I already mentioned without debt as opposed to debt-free. Education after high school is just a broader way to talk about it than simply college. There's several data points that I showed you where, and underneath that what we've heard in focus groups is kind of support for additional degree programs that can lead more quickly to a job or a career, not simply just a 4-year degree program. And then debt keeps education out of reach for too many people, as opposed to this idea that debt contributes to worsening inequality. Again, similar to how we talk about without debt as opposed to debt-free, making this about real people and humanizing this as opposed to kind of an abstract economic conversation is much more powerful language for generating support for policies that would make college more affordable. At the end of the day, you're talking about people in their transition from being child to young adult to adult and doing something that makes them happy and helps them pay the bills. And that is a much powerful kind of mindset to be having this conversation than a broader abstract conversations about political and economics in terms of economic inequality. So I'll pause there. I don't know if we have time for any questions, but I'm happy to ask any now or offline. Are you seeing candidates, particularly gubernatorial candidates, talking about higher education in this election cycle? Yes, we are. There are some partisan differences. Actually, prior to this, we looked quickly online, and at least at the Senate level, in Texas, Arizona, and Nevada, the Republican candidates don't even have higher education listed as a policy priority relative to their Democratic counterparts. So there are certainly some proposals that are out there, and I can't speak to the specific proposals that have been proposed, but it's something that's being talked about a little bit more with Democratic candidates as opposed to Republicans. I do not expect it to be kind of a highlighted issue in the run-up in terms of large paid communications. It might be something a little bit more targeted for younger voters who are more likely, frankly, to experience debt. But there is a difference in terms of partisans of who's actually talking about it. How do perceptions of college costs change across demographics, race, income, and age? And that's a good question. I showed you differences by party. Certainly, there's not a tremendous amount of difference, frankly, by income, but race and age, there are differences. So much stronger support for policies to make college more affordable and much stronger salience of the concerns among younger cohorts of voters, among communities of color, African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Pacific Islanders. The largest driver is partisanship, but younger folks and people of color have certainly have stronger concerns about the cost for education after high school, and also just a stronger sense that it is a very serious problem facing the country today. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let's give Jonathan another hand while the rest of the next panel is coming up. Thank you. My name is Bob Shireman. I am a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. You've already met me as the guy with really bad handwriting. In the following on Jonathan's really fascinating presentation, we are going to talk about federal-state partnerships regarding education after high school without debt, which benefits us all. Thank you. Thank you. We will try to get to that. So joining me here on stage, we have Indi Datta Gupta, who is the co-executive director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. Christian Haynes, who is Senior Education Policy Counsel for the Democratic staff of the House Education Committee. Rochelle Sharp, who's Deputy Executive Director of the Washington Student Achievement Council. That's the Washington over, north of California. It's over there, where I live. So Rochelle is also the president of something called NASGAP. For those of you who don't know, that's the Association of State Grant Programs, so people who run those kinds of programs. And Zakiya Smith-Ellis, the Secretary of Higher Education in New Jersey. Certainly today we have had the issue of the federal-state partnership has been emerging in the discussion over and over again. And I thought it would be useful to have Indi talk to us a bit about what should, the normative side, what should the role of the federal government be in relation to states and how this works with other kinds of social programs.
Great, thank you. I think that no one's hopefully expecting me to actually answer that question. What I want to talk about is sort of how you might think this through and what we can learn from other social programs, as mentioned. So in general, I'd say there are good reasons for a robust role for the federal government and for state governments. And we should pay particular attention to how much variation or uniformity we want. So we have the whole pretty much range of possibilities in some way or another already. We have programs like the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is overwhelmingly federal, but there is some state flexibility. There's actually a federal match for state administration and outreach costs. We have the UI program, which is primarily run by states within broad federal contours. This is something that honestly appeared to work until the Great Recession, as a lot of policies, I think, did. And afterwards, we saw states kind of, well, first of all, during the recession, with the exception of Washington State, federal government really had to step in. Washington State was one of the, if not the only state that had forward funded their unemployment insurance program in preparation for a recession. We had hearings, believe it or not, just months before the recession, where people told us the federal government should just give a lot of money to states, let them cut taxes, because there's too much money saved up in the unemployment insurance trust funds. So sometimes circumstances make us sort of change our minds. The federal government swept it and basically helped save the program and affected beneficiaries. But then what happened afterwards was striking, where many states basically decimated their programs. Then you've got programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is entirely federal, but a lot of states have their own, including I think both New Jersey and Washington, have their own complementary Earned Income Tax Credits that are essentially copycats. So the way I think about this is really about thinking about what incentives are faced by states, what is the history. Really, we end up with the systems we have because of some path dependence. And that doesn't mean we can't break away from that, but we're always starting there. And in particular, a couple of principles that I think about. The more a policy looks and feels like a direct transfer of resources to individuals and families, the more I think there's an argument for uniformity. And the intuition here is thinking about food. Our food needs don't vary dramatically or cost dramatically by where we live. Maybe a little bit, but not a lot. And so then there's a case for a federal role. And the more it feels and looks like a service, the more there's a case for more local administration, flexibility, oversight, especially of service providers. There's other factors I think about too, but the challenge here is higher education, I think, is sort of a hybrid in many ways. And then just finally, let me make a quick point about I think that whatever the role is that we decide makes sense. I increasingly am convinced that it's not possible to meaningfully guarantee something of quality to people everywhere without a robust federal role. And that's for a few reasons. We have a history of states, not all run by the Rochelles and Zakias of the world, basically taking advantage of every possible loophole you can imagine. When we think about regulating corporations, we think about that. Sometimes we think about it and make the wrong decision, but we think about that. We also need to think about that with regard to states. The waivers that everyone's hearing about in Medicaid for work requirements, the Section 1115 waivers, my colleagues and I wrote pages about how great these waivers could be and all the good things we could do with them. And now we think they're being used for a lot of harm. Secondly, the states fail to respond to demographic, economic, and other changes, including things that we may not think about, but like extreme weather, which I think we're going to see more and more. No one can borrow money as cheaply as the federal government. And states often have to balance their own budgets, regardless of the circumstances. They also feel that they're competing with their neighbors in a way that the federal government, I think, feels much less so. I want to just point out in particular that after the '96 welfare law, when we gave enormous flexibility to states, we saw a lot of what people frankly feared, which is the opening up of geographic disparities, but actually embedded in that are racial disparities. So when you don't have a robust sort of federal backstop or robust federal accountability and responsive funding, you can see that a lot. There are lots of ways around it, though, like I said. So for example, the last thing I'll say is, on the one hand, you can imagine in the Medicaid program where states haven't taken advantage of this incredibly generous match, that maybe that'll change over time, but meanwhile, there could be a federal public option, right, for those folks who are left out in those states. And just so folks know, the base Medicaid program that already existed was already voluntary, and it's actually less generous than the expansion. So the matches there are 50 to 76.9% from California to Mississippi, and every state came into compliance eventually. It took a while, Arizona in the early 80s, finally came into compliance and developed their own Medicaid program, but that's less generous than the expansion. And then we have examples like in the Great Society where we created a Head Start program, didn't trust states, and just went straight to local authorities, education agencies, and community-based organizations. And I think that may have been essential for avoiding some of the racial disparities we might have seen otherwise.
Christian, yeah, I think you've had to grapple this some from the congressional standpoint of how can we do some of these sorts of things.
Sure. And thanks for having me, Bob. And I just want to say off top, as my press shop has reminded me, we like Mr. Scott to be the only person quoted from the committee. So although I think all of you are cognizant of that, if there's anything you want to quote from my comments or anything, just reach out to our press shop and they'll take care of it. Thanks. And I think we have been grappling with it. And I think that while we agree with a lot of what I've just heard, I think that we see the federal government as being in a unique position to kind of rebalance the equation in terms of how students finance their education. I'm pretty much I've seen some of the people in the audience, I think a lot of you know this already, but 40 years ago, we saw the balance predominantly 2/3 of the costs were being borne by states and the federal government. And students could, through a combination of paying out of pocket, a little bit of student loan, and working, actually finance their education just fine. And that's really been inverted over the last 40 years. So you see that common meme of the old economy, Steve, like when I was your age, I paid for tuition through a job. Tuition was $400. So that's kind of I think probably part of the mindset that a lot of people have, and it explains possibly some of that polling data about people thinking that you can be able to pay your way through college with a job. And with that shift to the inversion of that, we've also seen the decade of state disinvestment. That drove this a lot more precipitously downward in a lot of different states. So states are now reinvesting in higher education, but not nearly enough to make up for that lost investment over the last decade. And that state disinvestment arguably has done more to drive up college costs over the last decade than any other factor. So I think that from the perspective of the committee and House Democrats, we see a federal-state partnership that can be used to help rebalance the equation and make college more affordable, or excuse me, education after high school more affordable for more students. And at the same time, I think work and generate some very positive reforms that would help students increase outcomes around completion and transfer rates. And that was kind of the mindset when creating the America's College Promise program that we worked with the Obama administration on in 2015 and reintroduced in 2017 and included in the comprehensive rewrite of the Higher Education Act, the AIM Higher Act that we introduced as a committee this summer. So I think that we see any move on HEA going forward should include a robust federal-state partnership. I think we're very open to the contours. We know there are a lot of ideas out there. We started with the one we thought kind of was the broadest appeal to everyone. Everyone kind of has the idea of the community college and kind of spoke to the idea that we all know education after high school in some form is going to be necessary for everyone. So
good job, education after high school.
Yeah.
That was very good.
Learning on the fly here. Yeah.
Very good. Rochelle, so you've got your Washington perch, but then also work with states all around the country.
Right, thank you. There is one more state north of California before Washington.
Yes, true.
My
My home is California. That's why
There you
I'm
go.
California-centric.
Right. Well, thank you. And so much has been said before me and in the previous panels. So I just want to note that in addition to the historical commitment to federal financial aid that states really rely on and appreciate, it is sort of a one size with the standard eligibility, and then states are able to really fine tune and complement that, and depending on their priorities. And one thing that hasn't been mentioned today that I think is part of the role, in addition to financial aid, is the importance of support programs. And I think the federal Gear Up program and TRIO programs really have amazing outcomes, and then states can come and expand those and learn lessons from the combination of financial aid with support services. We're all trying to, both the federal government and the states, become, and I'm trying to remember the right words for, globally competitive. I know these aren't words that would resonate with students, but provide opportunities for our residents and our Americans to be competitive. Washington, the other Washington, has quite a few amazing employers, some of whom you've heard of, and those employers have stepped forward to partner in this effort as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that.
Zakiya.
Okay, so I will share some thoughts on this from both the state side, but also having worked in the federal government before, and efforts where we tried to create federal-state partnerships with some people in the room that didn't ultimately pan out. And I think your initial question, which I will try to answer, was what should the role of the federal government maybe be in this way? I will actually say Mark Zuckerman was somebody that used to say, you know, the federal government spends so much on higher education. And when you and I started at the Department of Education, the Pell Grant funding was not the largest line item from the Department of Education. I think it was probably Title I or maybe IDEA. And now the Pell is really the largest line item, and that's a huge shift. And it also means that the federal government has nothing, and people on the other panels talked about this, but does nothing to really leverage that dollar. So you're just throwing money out there, and states can kind of pull back because there's no real state role in the funding for affordability. So states can say, oh yeah, you're increasing them, and it's not an intentional thing. You know, it's just like, oh, okay, well, the Pell has gone up. We don't necessarily, I mean, there's nothing that causes it. So when states have all these other kind of pressures, there's nothing that causes them to say, as federal policymakers or as people that are involved in the federal side of things, how are we ensuring that we're not kind of throwing good money after bad? How are we ensuring that this is really going to mean that the students pay less as a bottom line? And we do nothing in the federal HEA right now to make that happen. So I think that's on the federal side. From the state perspective, you know, you're doing all this great work. I think New Jersey has the best free community college program in the nation. I think all of the criticisms that are with the other free community college program don't apply to New Jersey because we've got it all right. And I will always say that I think we have one of the most progressive programs that will soon, before the end of the month, which is coming up very quickly, be announcing what we're going to be doing there. So just plug for watching New Jersey in the coming days on that front. But we don't get any credit from the federal government for that on the flip side. So we're doing all this great stuff. We're doing it out of the goodness of our hearts in New Jersey because we believe that this is the best thing for our students, but we don't get more federal Pell for that. We don't get any kind of, you know, bonus. And so other states who will remain nameless could cut student aid. They could, cut funding for higher education, and we would our residents get treated the same. So on both sides, I think that lack of connection is frustrating. So I think there should be a connection. The role of the federal government should be to foster a partnership with states through a federal-state partnership, and that would be dramatic. It would be something that hasn't been done in this way before. Now, there were some federal-state partnerships through like ARA. There was a state match, which we could talk about through the College Access Challenge Grant Program. There was a maintenance of effort, which probably wasn't large enough to see real impacts, but you did see impacts in the stimulus, right? That you saw states actually change their funding patterns because of something that the federal government do. So we know it could happen, and the question is, is the next Congress or the people in future administrations going to be bold enough to put forward a pretty drastic idea, which would be to create, similar to what was done in the committee bill that is sitting there now from the House Democrats, should we have a federal-state partnership that really leverages the federal dollar in a way to change state behavior?
Right. Let me go back to the two states again on that. So it was, and we're seeing, and someone said on an earlier panel, that states aren't waiting. Like, states aren't waiting around saying, well, okay, when's the federal partnership coming? They're instead going forward with things. So if we do get to a point in the next couple of years where the federal government is coming in and saying, we want to partner with you, and I think a case has been made that there needs to be some expectations and accountability. Tiffany mentioned earlier the importance of equity measures and holding states accountable. While on the one hand, you are the saintly states that are doing the right thing, but it's quite possible that some of what the federal government would expect might be different from the decisions that you have already been making. Can you talk some about those dynamics of how would your states respond if federal government came in and said, this is how we think you should be doing things if you want our money?
Well, I think there are so many approaches. I think about $12.5 billion in state financial aid is provided, and 3/4 of that is need-based. And we've seen, in the next NASGAP survey will be out in about 2 weeks, we've seen the increase in dollars in need-based aid, and we've seen some states try new things. Nevada just started a new need-based program, the Silver State Opportunity Grant, I believe. And so every state, no matter where you are, no state is perfect, even Washington State, who has, when you rank the need-based funding by the number of undergraduate enrollments, Washington is first or second in the nation. But we have a program that's underfunded. It's not an entitlement. We have 23,000 students with zero, and we have students with $10,000 if they're attending University of Washington. So very generous awards that rely on the Pell Grant, does not reduce the award if students receive the Pell Grant. And so we have work to do. States will also try new approaches. I mentioned the employer involvement. In Washington, we have an opportunity. We like the word opportunity. An opportunity scholarship where Boeing and Microsoft have committed $50 million over 5 years. It's focused on STEM. We do have programs that are targeted on workforce shortages. We have loan forgiveness programs, loan repayment programs, either building a pipeline of students for a particular shortage area or incenting those to work in the field on the back end with repayment. We have states that have reformed their programs. Massachusetts, Mississippi, and others have worked with national experts to really think about what the student outcomes are. We have a lot of work to do, I think, around simplicity, both at the federal and state message, and I completely agree, it's not the design of the program, it's the helping students understand and coordinating across agencies, both at the federal and local level. Washington has one of the more restrictive policies for the work requirements for child care subsidies, for example. So I think meeting states where they are and saying, what are your goals, and let's move the needle even further.
Christian, have things gotten far enough in the congressional proposals where you've gotten any pushback from states about, well, you're asking for this from us, but we can't deliver that?
I don't think as of yet, because I think that we haven't been in a political space where the idea has gotten to the point where people think, well, we're there, let's start talking. I think it's much more in a theoretical space. But I'd also say that in thinking about the reforms that you would include in a partnership, I think that there's no desire to upset the robust need aid programs that are out there at states now. And I think that a lot of what the ACP as law or as a bill incentivizes are things that I'd argue the strongest state higher ed programs are either already done or already taking on, recognize that this is kind of where the field is moving, and it's more about, we're less concerned with our prodigal states than the ones that are kind of returning to the fold, hopefully, in this kind of situation. So I think we're talking about things like making sure that the transfer via articulation agreement holds for all the credits that you would get at your 2-year program that could transfer to a baccalaureate degree. That full articulation doesn't exist in every state now. We don't see that you are getting post-secondary credentials that are actually in-demand industry, recognized by in-demand industries. Those are kind of things that some states are already doing, some states aren't. And then the educational reforms like comprehensive academic and student support services, dual enrollment and concurrent enrollment programs increased, advancing competency-based education, strengthening remedial education. These are all things that I think that the states that are really focused on improving their systems are already tackling those issues. And in the bill as written, it would be required for states to kind of explain how they're making these efforts done. And sometimes it'll be new things, and sometimes it'll be, well, this is what we're already doing. And I think there's a world where both can exist. And the idea is you try to want to incentivize that behavior. And if it's already being done by some of the states, we're not going to attempt to, or our intent is not to get in the way of that work. So I think that's kind of the mindset we were coming at it from. So already working with where the field is in a lot of the really high-performing states on higher education, and not trying to upset those goals, but replicate them around the country.
So, Indy, what could you sort of predict will be some of the problems that are going to come up based on sort of how things have emerged in other programs?
Well, I think partly Zakiya mentioned the cost control issue, and the reality is we generally don't worry a lot about we worry some, but not a lot about the cost of, if you take SNAP and food assistance, we don't worry a lot about it inflating the cost of food significantly. We don't worry a lot about the quality of food. It's a whole robust other set of policies, regulations, and a market, really, that you're just plugging a small share of people into. A robust federal subsidy like the Pell Grant program can completely change the calculations of institutions and states, right? So I think that's a major thing. That
And SNAP is income restricted, so it's only
in-
going to a
it's
small percentage of
that's
the
what I'm
people,
saying.
not
It's
the, yeah.
going, you know, at the height of the Great Recession, it was going to 1 in 7, but typically it's fallen dramatically now. So that's exactly right. So you have to really worry about that. That's where matches come in. I think that getting a match right, and it's not just about a match on funding, but it can be efficient. It can, of course, as I said, it can discourage some states from complying. But so I worry particularly about which states won't participate, and then I worry about within states, will there still be accountability measures, not just about quality, but access to? Sometimes I think you really need to pair them both, because sometimes states will be overwhelmed by focusing on one or the other. And as we know, there are trade-offs, so you sort of want to force them to try to do them in tandem. To me, I think that's the biggest challenge. These are genuinely hard things to design. I don't think they're impossible to say the least, but it's genuinely hard to design good quality measures that aren't going to lead states to, we see this in childcare too. We increased quality requirements in a childcare reauthorization bill a couple years ago. And sure enough, states would have, it was a bipartisan bill. There's no new money. States had to cut slots. There was no other way. Fortunately, we've come back and added a lot of money to it. But I think the access quality sort of trade-off is something that you're going to see tension with.
Great. Let's skip ahead a little bit to that quality question since you brought it up. Much like childcare, I think Mark Hulsman earlier mentioned that in K-12 we decided at some point to have to require everyone to go to K-12 schools. We don't do that in higher education. We don't do that in childcare. We can make choices in public policy about how many seats are we going to open up and then who gets them. So unlike in K-12, there's this tension in states between providing more access, or at least a potential tension, more access, more seats, more years that people can take of college, versus how much is spent for each student. How have we grappled with that? Is
Not
that
enough.
just sort of sitting out there as a we're gonna have to?
I think as we talk about bold, transformative ideas that could incentivize states, and we think about what are the outcomes that we want to see. I can't remember. I think it was Julie Morgan who mentioned we really should talk about what are the outcomes that we want to see. Like, yes, we want people to not have to pay, but ultimately we want who to not have to pay. I think Tiffany would say we want. Because you could design a program right now where you say, I'm going to make all college, free for people that go to the University of Virginia, let's just say, right? And it would make a lot of people happy, and there's no kind of, that's it, University of Virginia will be tuition free, maybe we'll even pay for the room and board, we'll just spend all the money, and we'll close all of the other public colleges in Virginia, and everybody that goes to the University of Virginia will go for free, completely free, all free, everything free, food free, great dining plan, and we wouldn't think that that was a great outcome, because not that many people in Virginia, it doesn't have a great record on kind of being open access to people in the state of Virginia. Two, there's probably no rule on how many people they would have to accept, so you would be doing it for a very small number of people. So do we want to see more people going to college? Do we want to see more low-income students going to college? I frankly think that when we evaluate the pros and cons of different approaches, we should actually look at what the outcome is and not just who the money is designed to, because the message could draw more people in, even if the money isn't designed to necessarily be targeted to those people. And we should care about what is the end goal. So at the end of your policy, do you have more people that were not previously going to, if that's your goal, maybe your goal is not that. I've heard other people say that, no, my goal is just to make college free for people who are already going, and that's not my thing, but if that's your thing, then, but we should just be clear on what that goal is. And one of the things that we need to, I think, spend more time and attention to is what are the admissions policies, because when we think about making K-12 free or other public services, like libraries or parks or whatever that people don't have to pay to go to, it's not usually restricted in the same way that much of higher education can be restricted, which is part of the reason I've become a convert to free community college. Because in general, community colleges do not have the same kinds of restrictions, and we can get into the pros and cons or what four-year colleges do and don't do. But in general, the kind of uniform aspect about community college is that they're open access, that they're in every community, that there's not, you don't have to get on a bus to get there, you don't have to get on a plane to go somewhere. In New Jersey, there's whole counties that don't have any public four-year option, and that's the case in most places. People have done work on college deserts, or whatever they want to call them, education deserts. So the idea that there's a place where you can go that's accessible, that as long as you have a high school credential, or sometimes not even, that you can go and it's open, we should think about. We've got this situation, I know I've been talking for a while, but in New Jersey, we haven't spent money on higher education operational aid in a long time. And we have autonomy now for institutions. So you see institutions, if you're just going to get the same amount that you got every year, they've made different choices about what to do. Some have decided, okay, we'll just serve the same number of people we used to serve because we're not going to get more money. We don't do money per student. We just give people the same amount of money they got 20 years ago, basically, is the policy decision. Or you could expand access, and you do that, and then you have to think about, well, how are we going to pay? Do we increase tuition? But those are, I could give you names of institutions, and they've made these different choices, and I think you could see the same thing happen in states unless you're clear about what outcomes you want to see.
Right. Michelle, thoughts?
Well, I think the question of quality relates to the earlier discussion about the disinvestment in higher education among states, and states are complicated, and states budgeting is complicated. We not only had the Great Recession, but we've had, several states have had lawsuits around fully funding basic education, and many other constraints and demands on the state budget. I think, Zakiya, you mentioned goals, and I know we've worked together on this. I think one thing states could do immediately is define their goals. State legislatures turn over, governors turn over, and put a marker in the sand. This is what we mean by affordability. This is what we're moving toward. This is what we value. And then, even when there are economic downturns, you can measure your progress against that goal. We have not done that perfectly in Washington, but we've made some strides around an affordability framework and putting data on a dashboard and trying to get with every new member of the legislature to help articulate our history and where we're trying to go and measure new policies against it. I think. Sorry for only talking about Washington, but I do know it a little more than the rest of the states. And we have an interesting history in terms of that disinvestment. And during the recession, we were third highest in the nation in the rate of tuition increases. I think Georgia and Arizona were the other two. And then our legislature, even with very difficult economic climate, and during the recession, froze tuition for 4 years and backfilled institutions. And then I believe the only state that then reduced tuition by 20%, not a few percentages over 2 years. So it is possible to kind of move ourselves slowly back toward where the state was paying the lower share. We don't have an income tax. We're weird. I mean, there's a lot of unique revenue streams in Washington, but even in that circumstance, to make a commitment bipartisan, I think was something to look at.
Right. Would you expect that a federal partnership might measure, I mean, we've talked a lot about affordability, so some kind of measure of affordability would be a part of it, but would you think it should look at access? So something about actual enrollment of people from all income backgrounds, races, et cetera.
Access, equity, completion, I think has to all be part of it. Right. And we're doing a lot of work looking at the regions of the state. Not only are states not cookie cutter, but there are very unique needs within a state as well.
I think the equity issues are kind of baked into the idea of starting with community college because we know it is open access. And then also in terms of the requirements on states, when I was going through that litany of reforms and evidence-based practices that we were expecting states to kind of implement or describe what they're doing. In the law, it also, or in the bill, it also describes how those are being targeted disproportionately. Communities that don't disproportionately access higher education now, minorities, lower income students, and first generation students. So we're expecting the states in a partnership to kind of focus on that equity in the bill as we write it. So that was kind of at the table to begin with. So we're hoping that's where we don't put explicit requirements on quality as in terms of like set completion rates or graduation rates, but the goal is that the reforms that you're incentivizing would lead to increases there.
Andy, any further thoughts on the sort of tension issue? Okay, great. So what kind of an investment would it take by the federal government to make a difference, to get states to take some of these steps that we want them to take, maybe and some states that are not the ones that are represented here? And an interesting comparison, we have this example of where this 90% or so match on the Medicaid expansion resulted in a number of states rejecting it. On the other hand, I think about the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, where the federal component is in the single digit percentage-wise, but states all take that money, and it has over time been very much of a tail that wags the dog kind of thing, where they do all kinds of things with the whole system because in order to maintain that single digit percentage of investment. And I don't even quite know how to make those things make sense, the two of them.
Well, I mean, those are two very different programs. So I think, again, public K-12, where everybody has access and it doesn't have an income, limit on who can go to high school or elementary school, or sometimes maybe pre-K programs, but we want to expand pre-K as well, right? Versus Medicaid, which became very politicized. And so that was one of the notes I had earlier, which was, in normal times, you would expect that if you put money on the table and say you're going to match it. We had a LEAP program where states created financial aid programs on nothing because the federal government was providing matching dollars. And that was enough of an incentive. You had a good deal of money, and states said, hey, if I create this thing, I get a one. I don't remember if it was 1 for 1, but it was a good match, right? And so it's like a no-brainer. We'll do it and we'll get it. Versus what happened in the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid expansion, where it became a highly politicized issue, and it became a badge of honor to say, I'm going to reject this money from Washington to the detriment of the people in my state. And I mean, maybe you know how that is playing out now, but I do think we need to, that just is a weird shift in paradigm where people just really hated President Obama and wanted to show that they weren't going to do anything that he touched. And so I don't know how much that continues in the next era, but I do think that's one of the tensions when developing a federal program in general is, are you trying to reward people that have done a good job, in which case, you say, yes, you've done the things that we want you to do, so therefore you get money, or are you trying to provide a benefit for people who their states are pulling back, so you want to help them, right? You want to step in as the federal government. And I think that's just a tension, because otherwise you just see these states get worse and worse and worse, and the people in their states, I worry, I'm from Georgia, think about the Deep South and places where people have just been staunchly, hopefully we'll have different leadership in Georgia and they'll be more open to those kinds of things. And maybe I shouldn't say that, but there's a governor's election happening. So we'll see what happens in the future. But in some of those states where it's very politically unpopular to be seen as, or it was politically unpopular to be seen as partnering with Washington, I don't know how much of that continues. Otherwise, the only challenge is how much money does it really take to get people to make big changes. And I think there it just depends on how big of a change are you asking people to make. Programmatically, as you mentioned, kind of I can't remember you have great examples from outside of higher ed, which I love, right? But programmatically or dollar-wise, it's pretty clear. I mean, when we were I was at the Department of Education when we had the College Access Challenge grants, and states were like, yep, nope, the amount of money that you're gonna give me in this challenge grant is not more than the amount of money that you're asking me to spend to fund higher education. I think it was like Louisiana had cut like $200 million or something, and they were like, so you're going to be a $2 million grant, and I've cut $200 million. No, thank you. We'll just move on. But if there's a you're going to get more. I know our governor always talks about our federal give-get rate. New Jersey gives more in tax dollars to the federal government than it gets back in federal programs. So if there was just a clear calculation, yeah, we spend $50 million, we get $100 million. It's like, oh yeah, it's a no-brainer. You do it.
I think that we're not exactly sure is probably the best answer. I think that in looking at the different examples we've had, I think you have at one end the Medicaid example, and I think you have at one end Title I, and I think the compulsory nature of K through 12 really does drive that, and the fact that K-12 is a quintessential local issue, and governors, all local politicians to some extent have to talk about the value of their state's education over others, and why our schools are better, and why you want to move here for our schools. And so that's kind of just ingrained in that world where it might not be still yet for healthcare, and we're probably just getting there for higher education. So I think you have to have a higher percentage, of course, than you would in higher education. But I don't know if you go like full 95%. In ACP, we have 75-25, and an expectation that states that are already having robust investments can use that as part of the 25. So I think it will vary, but I think that's kind of where we are now, and we're just not sure, because I think when we were working on it with the Department of Education, and their estimates were that this would be about $90 to $100 billion. Our ledge counsel rightfully said, maybe you should put a rateable reduction in there in case that's not enough money to pay for all of this. And we don't know, but we know that if you had more states taking this up and you increase the number of students you had on campus who are actually going to community colleges, it might not be enough. We're not sure. I think the jury's still out.
Right. Good.
I'll just say, in addition to the question about the investment, I think there's a question about sort of enforcement of whatever's expected. And there's a question about what the alternatives are. So my colleagues and I have developed a proposal to establish a national subsidized jobs program. It's based on a federal-state partnership because we thought that would be the most efficient way to do it. We recognize some states will not comply even with incredibly generous matches. So we developed a competitive federal grant program that would be targeted to places in particular states that did not come into compliance with the first program. Then states have a choice in a scenario like that. Okay, say, I don't know, the state of Indiana says we don't want to participate. Well, community-based organizations, local governments can participate directly with the government, so with the federal government instead. And then states might think, wait, don't I want this generous match instead to have a coordinated strategy and program? Rather than having sort of all sorts of different programs that don't necessarily neatly fit into my overall system and strategy. And so I think they're creative sort of answers, and it is definitely about matching funding to what's being asked for, but also about sort of what the alternatives are and what sort of enforcement and accountability there is.
Great. So a lot of states have pretty large merit aid programs that some analysis would suggest are inequitable in terms of driving a lot of money to higher income families and not really serving low income families. How should the federal government be thinking about those if it is providing some kind of matching to states?
Well, I mean, I think that, again, the question of what outcomes do you want to see, right? So if the outcome is that you want to see more low-income students go to and graduate from college, the test would be show us how your program, gets to that end. And I think some of the merit programs don't do that. I would note that it's hard for me to sometimes see what the distinction is between the old school merit programs, again, from Georgia in the heyday of the Georgia Hope Scholarship Program, and what we're talking about now in some of the Promise programs. From what I can tell, it's about 0.5 of a GPA. So 3.0 to 2.5 is the difference between a need-based program that everybody loves, that's a progressive thing, and a merit program which was like, boo, boo, bad, stop doing it. And I just think we should kind of test our own assumptions about what we think is good policy, because otherwise Georgia and Tennessee and a lot of places have had free college for a long time.
Right. Yeah.
I think some customization and flexibility when working with states. Some of the merit programs, because of the awareness, the sheer awareness of the program across the state, have led to higher FAFSA completion and higher more discussions about the value of something after high school. and pursuing, aiming high for students. So there's some benefits, even if the dollars are not targeted to the lowest income students. And then there's also on the role question, the ability to work together with the federal government, take a page out of LEAP, Leveraging Educational Assistance Program, taking some pages out of CACG of what not to, emphasis on challenge and the College Access Challenge Grant, what worked well and what was challenging, and maybe target a need that everyone is trying to address, including developing not only affordability, but infrastructure for adults. That really a few states have begun, but they're fairly new, not only out of the goodness of their hearts, but with some Lumina funding and others to get those programs started. And they're different, they're new, and it's an area that I think could be ripe for partnership.
Like Zakiya said, while the merit-based, need-based distinction is not as disparate as you might believe in some of these programs, I think that one of the things we looked at was, I wouldn't say a indicator for merit, but making sure that schools were also, or excuse me, that states were in efforts to maintain effort in their higher education, not doing dramatic shifts away from four-year, because we wouldn't want to disincentivize that. So it's not exactly an indicator of merit, but at the same time recognizing that if we're going to incentivize states to open up the two-year system, we don't want to then also have on the downside of that decrease in investment in four-year.
I'd just add that on the conversation about merit in particular, we should think about the responsibilities and the sort of levers and ways to hold accountable to institutions too. Now, I think it's often overly focused on the students, but also on the institutions themselves. I think that, again, those are sort of tough questions, but often people who, maybe a half a point in GPA, for example, is the difference between them qualifying and staying in or not, need more than just the financial aid, some of the support programs and services and things that, with the right incentives, an institution might help them succeed.
Let me follow up with you and ask, just because you've worked with all of these other programs, whether there are one or two key lessons that we haven't talked about yet that you think are really important to keep in mind, or that have come up but need to be underscored.
I don't think we've talked a lot about interstate issues, but that could be relevant here. People move, and data sharing. There's a robust system in the unemployment insurance. I know David here knows all about it. But there's a robust system of interstate sort of sharing of data and whatnot. I think that's quite relevant when you have states sort of owning this. And then I think that stability we haven't talked about directly, but generally federal programs have been sort of more stable over time. You don't see the volatility you see sometimes with dramatic swings, for example, that Rochelle mentioned, even in Washington State's commitment to higher ed. I think that matters. I mean, so if people need to plan for these things. I mean, this is a huge commitment and a risk to take on higher education. It's a risk we think most people should take, but I think that those things are something we should really think about as we design a partnership.
Great. So there was I think probably the most radical proposal mentioned this morning was Will saying, let's take all of that money, Pell Grants at least, I think, I'm not sure about the student loan side of thing, and basically funnel it to states, and states figure out how do we get access, affordability, whatever else. Now, I don't know whether we can get there from here or whether we should get there from here, but any thoughts, reactions, and knowing that we all have semi-political roles, feel free to just tell me you're not going to answer that question.
Yeah, I'm not going to answer that question.
All right, great.
I appreciate bold ideas because it causes us, I think you told me this at one time, it causes us to have something to react to and say, okay, if the status quo is not acceptable, let's look at a bold idea and actually talk about, what the pros and cons are. Anytime you change from so we've been doing this system for a while, and we kind of all agree that it has some serious flaws. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily all bad, though, and so I do think about system shock, right? So I'm gardening now. And when you I'm hesitating changing the seasons because you have to like pull the plants out from outside sometimes in their pots, bring them inside, and that can cause the plant to be shocked and die. And so I think about like changing from a system, even though it may be like suboptimal, like the caterpillars are outside and they eat my basil and I don't like it. But, maybe I bring the basil inside. It's like, no caterpillars, but also, not as much direct access to sunlight or whatever. So I guess the analogy to this would be, yes, Pell and the way we're doing things now have its problems, but a kind of bold, like we're going to just stop that. We're going to funnel all of it to the states could have other kind of challenges that we should just be very wary about. And I wonder sometimes of a new program that could maybe supplement. What I would propose is like a new program that could supplement it, that we could kind of figure out. You'd usually do this, harden off your plants, so you have them inside, and then when you take them outside, you do a little bit each day, and then over time, they're all the way outside. So if the analogy, you could have like a new program, and then maybe a little bit more over time, a little bit more over time, and then we're kind of comfortable with it, we're familiar with it, we know what's going to happen, and it can stand on its own. Right. The other big thing that I would say is just when we talk about states, we do have to be very careful about, I think, and I don't remember all of the details of Will's proposal, but there was a lot of flexibility left to the states. And there's a big difference from as Indy mentioned, a federal state program where it's essentially federal government is telling states, you do X, Y, and Z. You give this, you're basically a pass-through. You give this money to people in your state that meet these criteria, and you're better poised to give it to them than we are. And maybe you have some different like state packaging of it, and it can be better versus, I'm going to give you a block grant. And you do whatever with that block grant that you would like. And I will say that I don't necessarily trust some states to, take the money and maybe they decide, yeah, we're going to be the state that just wants to make our research flagship that doesn't really serve that many people affordable and not do anything for anyone else. Or maybe we're going to be the state there. Are some states that, we're going to give all of ours to for-profits because they don't get any money from anyone else or something. You know what I mean? Like they don't get any, like you could, and it's okay because that's what the state wanted to do and they looked at their state needs and that's what they felt like was okay. Like that would be a really bad outcome. So just giving money to the states and being like, you figure it out because you're closer to your constituents. I actually think we have a lot of evidence from lots of federal programs that will lead to vastly different results in states and probably somewhat predictable in terms of what some states might do and who they think is deserving versus others.
I thought about a way I actually can answer this question now. I think that when we're thinking about the federal-state partnership, at least from the committee's perspective, we're thinking about it as just one piece of the larger rewrite of higher education. So I think that in a world where you're increasing the Pell Grant, indexing it to inflation, where you're simplifying the student loan system for everybody, making sure repayment works for everyone, instituting stronger accountability controls, providing more programs at the federal level to accelerate completion through two-year schools. I think when you look at all of those things together, it's kind of like the reverse of system shock. You're looking at everything and kind of putting it on the table. So I think that is the kind of way that we think about it, not just as this one little thing that we would do and not touch anything else. Right. It would have to be part of like a holistic move.
So if one of the problems we see from the past is that we shoveled all this money out the door for affordability, but we didn't actually ask for accountability on affordability, right. That a new program can piggyback on top of that and say, okay, we've done a lot of good, but we need to bring affordability in. Now, does that mean that that in order for a state-federal partnership to work, that we need some kind of common, across the nation definition of what we mean by affordability?
I mean, I'll just say from other contexts, this is exactly sort of what we tried to do in the 96 welfare law. Wide open, flexible funding, broad purposes. The funding's not super responsive to some of the changes I mentioned, including demographic and economic, but virtually no accountability. It sort of reminds me whenever my son climbs up on his top bunk and wants to jump off. This will never end well. This will never end well. I mean, it might take time. States will figure out, they will exploit every little possible way, because they'll be under pressure to do that, just to be clear. They have internal, legislative, fiscal, other pressure. They will find every way to use that money, because it's flexible, for something. They might supplant other funding for something else. I mean, there are situations in which we could probably draw a straight line between this open-ended sort of funding for, not open-ended in the sense of it can increase. In fact, in TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, is a fixed block grant, but it's so flexible. We could probably draw a straight line between that and tax cuts. Just really not, I think, what the federal government intended to be doing.
Other thoughts on that?
You could probably use, I'm looking for Will, I don't know where he went, but maybe take a look at the way states administer financial aid. Some are centralized, where the state will determine exactly what the criteria are, who the students are. We will do the selection and awarding. And others are decentralized, and it really is like a block grant, where under a few parameters then the institutions will do that and see if there's any differences around achieving the goal. I worry a little bit about that the states are really, because it's our role to think about tuition policy, that we will tie Pell to tuition so much that there's not funding for cost of attendance, other non-tuition expenses.
I want to acknowledge one other question, and we probably have 10 seconds a person to kind of get to an answer. But the question was, could a model like all-payer rate setting in healthcare be an example of how this partnership could drive down higher education delivery costs? And whether you know about all-payer rate setting or not, I don't. But that question of the cost of providing higher education, and which obviously affects the expenses of states and tuition and students, et cetera. Any thoughts on how this partnership could or should address that delivery costs question?
10 seconds. I think that there can be a model related to what we've seen in healthcare, where even in the Affordable Care Act health insurance marketplace, we have bands based on quality and affordability, and subsidies can vary based on that. And we generally need to send more signals to people about the quality of the education that they're essentially enrolling for and committing to. So I think there's something to be learned there, but every market and every sort of good here and public good is dramatically different, so it'll take a lot of new thinking.
Yeah, I think that you'd have to think about the differences in states, especially around geography. Maybe might be a big concern, because the cost of delivery methods in a state with a very low density is going to be different than, say, New Jersey. I think you're going to have to really think through where you would set that rate and what kind of boundaries you'd put around it for states to really realistically think about what it costs to deliver those services in the state, even though the services themselves aren't vastly different.
I think we need to incent in states stick-to-itiveness, and I'm glad Indy informed me that we forward-funded employment insurance. I think we should do that for financial aid programs. I'm going to take that back, because we need predictable tuition, stable financial aid, and supported institutions in every state.
I won't necessarily answer because I don't know enough about the rate setting, but I do think we should, as the policy wonk crowd, and much has been said about the difference between the policy wonks and the general everyday people who are kind of listening to their governor or congressman, whatever, talk about what they're going to do for them. This is the crowd that should be thinking about the cost, because I think we have got it in our mind that net price is the thing that we think about, and we don't talk enough about the underlying cost differences and start to go through some of those messy pieces, because I think the more we're serious about trying to provide a clear affordability guarantee, we're going to see some of the challenges and the underlying cost pieces come out. So real cost, Robert Kelchin, wherever you are, maybe you're listening, real cost and quality, talking about those two things within this crowd, because that's going to be the next thing. Once we figure out the affordability, it's going to be like, okay, what do we do about cost and quality?
Fantastic. Well, let's thank the panel. Thank you so much.